Hello and welcome back to Radio 2. So today we're starting with a new module and a new chapter, which is news, sport, traffic and weather. So this is part 1 of 4. So if you want to follow along in your textbook, today we're using Next Level Radio, chapter 5 from page 182 up until page 193. So how do radio journalists decide what events fall into the category of news? How do these journalists decide what should go into the bulletin, what should be allowed to be discussed in the editorial of a program, and what should be given to the regular non-news presenters to discuss? So we use the following criteria to help define what makes the news and what doesn't. Is it new? Is it unusual? Is it interesting? Is it significant? Is it about the people? The answers to these questions usually define the newsworthiness of a story. The more newsworthy elements the story has, the more valuable it becomes to a listener. So if we look at these in a bit more detail, is it new? If it's not new, it can't be news. For example, the sudden and tragic death of a famous pop star from 2005 fits all of the criteria of newsworthiness. It's unusual and it's significant and it's people-centric. However, because it happened in 2005, it's not news. If, however, new information is released about the pop star's death today, and this information is significant in the manner of the star's death, then this information would be news. Is it unusual? For something to be unusual, it has to be uncommon. There has to be something different about it. It has to be odd or out of the ordinary. These are the kinds of people or occurrences that make the news. So it's things that are unusual, it's things that are strange. A news story should have characters and people should be involved. The listeners should care about these characters. If not about others, then the story should personally affect the listener's health or their safety. It should affect them emotionally. It should affect their money, or it should affect another personal concern. Instead of using this newsworthy criterion, you can also use the following checklist of questions. Does the story have a strongly defined subject? Is this new information? Who cares? How will it matter to the listener? Would you have a conversation with someone about the story off air? Does this story affect the health or safety, human emotion, money, or other concerns of our listeners? If so, how? Who are the characters or the people involved in the story? Do you care about them? Will the listeners care? Newsworthiness can be defined by the following: how many people it affects, the reaction that it will get from the audience, the shock factor, the reach that it has, so is it of national importance, whether the issue itself is long running, who is involved in the story, so for example, are they famous, and lastly, why this story came about. Is it that unusual? Let's look at the following criteria for the story. So firstly, timing. News means quite literally things that are new. Topics that are current are newsworthy. There's so much new news around that old news is quickly being discarded. Significance. The number of people affected by the story is important. A plane crash in which hundreds of people die is more significant than a crash that kills 3 people. Proximity. Stories that happen near us have more significance. The closer to home a story is, the more newsworthy it is. For someone living in a small town, let's say in France, a bus crash in their city, so let's say a bus crash in Paris, can have as much significance as a plane crash does in New York City. Proximity does not always mean geographical distance, but also emotional connections and relatability. If I can't relate, it's not going to matter to me. How close to the heart is the story? Prominence. As a rule, famous people get more coverage. If a local footballer in the Sunday League breaks his arm, it isn't as significant as a prominent English Premier League footballer breaking his leg. Human interest. Human interest stories have their own set of rules, as they often disregard the main rules of newsworthiness. For example, they don't become outdated as quickly. They need not affect large numbers of people, and it may not matter where in the world the story takes place. Human interest stories appeal to the emotions of listeners. They aim to evoke responses such as amusement or sadness. Television news programs often place a humorous or a quirky human interest story at the end of the show to finish on a feel-good note, especially if the listener had to sit through death, tax, destruction, things like that in the main bulletin. Newspapers often have a dedicated area of interest, of interesting human interest stories. Finally, there are 2 other factors that journalists should consider before going with a story, namely closeness and personal impact. The same event happening in 2 different places can have 2 very different news values. A revolution here in South Africa will be bigger news for us than one in our neighboring country, for instance. The appeal of local news is that listeners are likely to know the people or places involved. Keep in mind that the concept of local is relative to the area of the broadcast. So, for example, 5FM from an international point of view is a local station. But for someone living, let's say in Uppington, for instance, it's not a local station. National radio stations in South Africa may struggle with this concept. If the presenters are sitting in Cape Town, then they can't assume that the story about something happening in Sea Point or Long Street is going to find resonance and understanding with people in Johannesburg or in Durban or Polokwane, where in total they are broadcasting to more listeners than just those listeners in Cape Town. If we look at personal impact, people understand and can identify with stories about other people. The larger the number of people who identify with a story, the bigger the story. A journalist must have a good grasp of who the average listener is and what their aspirations are. They might want a good education for their children, a new car or a vacation, or they may be looking forward to participating in a community festival or a holiday. A journalist must understand these aspects in order to better deliver news that has a personal impact on the audience. People can identify with stories about other people who are similar to them. So those stories with which many people can identify are stronger than those with which only a few people can identify. Sourcing news is about two things: how to get news and where the news comes from. If we start by looking at how to get news, journalists often find that news comes to them instead of them going out to look for it. Governments host press briefings and send out press releases, speeches and announcements of any new developments, and these come straight to the newsroom thanks to the writing and the distribution techniques of press officers and public relations specialists. News journalists often repackage or sometimes pass on that which they deem to be interesting and informative from a relevance perspective, which is an important function of the press in any country. Where news comes from. There's also news that journalists have to find for themselves and reveal to the public. This doesn't have to be a subject that somebody wants to keep a secret. So the type that involves digging up information that some people don't want surfaced, specifically then investigative journalism. So this doesn't mean just investigative journalism. Many people have a story to tell, but they may not know how to write a media release. So it's part of a journalist's job to find these people and to report their stories. Stories that are in the public interest deserve to be published. Such situations must be investigated fairly, but fearlessly. News can be categorized into 15 categories, which we're going to look at now. It's important to do some research into these, so to search for headlines online, as that will provide you with a bit more context to these news categories. Let's start there by looking at conflicts. So this category includes armed conflicts such as wars, revolutions, protests, the looting we had here a few weeks ago. It also includes strikes, elections, and political power battles. The second one, disasters and tragedies. These include air, rail, and ship disasters, natural disasters, or human tragedies. So for example, children falling into pit toilets and dying. Thirdly, we get progress and development. So development news must show the effect of a specific event on people's lives, whether this be positive or negative. Improvements are always good news stories. For example, education, technology, farming techniques, road building, and so on. These stories affirm people's sense of well-being. For example, the 20 key points from the State of the Nation address, including plans on 2 million new jobs and an urgent bailout for Eskom. Then we get crime. Any crime can be news, from road traffic offences to murder. Serious or rare crimes make big news stories. Money. These stories include fortunes made and lost, financial scams, the cost of school fees, tax, any changes to the government budgets, food prices, wage rises, economic crisis, and compensation claims. Note here that there's not necessarily the amount of money. It's not necessarily the amount of money that makes a money story news. Matters related to money are relative in their terms. And then we have the underdog. This is always a feature in the best novels and in movies. The idea that a person with negligible power can obtain great wealth, success, or reputation. Think of all your favorite books and movie characters. So, for example, David and Goliath in the Bible, or Tom Cruise's character, Jack Reacher. Almost every reality TV show you will watch closely follows the characters who are underdogs. Think of American Idol, South Africa, American Idol, The Voice, South Africa's Got Talent, that kind of shows. A traditional role of the journalist is to defend the rights of the average person over wealthy corporates or powerful politicians. These stories inspire people and give them hope. Next, we have religion. The first type of religious news includes the kind of stories affecting people's religious lives, such as the new church or an annual pilgrimage. The second type includes statements by religious leaders on spiritual affairs, such as contraception or gay marriage. Journalists should be aware of the religious nature of their communities. In South Africa, it's important to understand the relevance of cultural beliefs and traditional religious faiths as well. Then famous people. Well-known personalities are always news fodder. Okay, they're always in the news. What famous people do in public and the lives that they lead are all newsworthy. Health. Stories about medical issues always make the news, and these include medical breakthroughs and diseases. And then sex. It's true that sex sells. Most news stories in this category circle around sexual behavior that is not generally accepted or acceptable according to that particular society's standards. With the advent of technology, there are many newsworthy stories related to, for example, internet sex behavior. And then we have weather. The weather has an effect on everyone's lives and their daily routine. Consider, for example, unusual weather like extreme temperatures or rainfall. Food and drink. Humans celebrate food, whether they are rich or poor. For example, music, dance, theater, cinemas, and festivals. Entertainment news always covers developments in the arts. Who's doing what, who's performing where, and what is worth going to see or hear. Then sport, people like hearing or reading about sports people, as well as sports events. They are always interested in results. And last one, human interest. Human interest stories are interesting or unusual occurrences in the lives of people to whom the target market can relate. They may not be particularly significant or far-reaching, but they contextualize things for people as they go about their daily lives. Examples could include a child undergoing new and experimental treatment or surgery, or a man with a collection of over 1,000 pieces of Ferrari memorabilia. Let's look at writing and reporting for news. Stories must get to the heart of the matter as quickly as possible. Unlike fiction or non-fiction books, in a radio news bulletin, people don't have time to thoroughly consider and absorb what they are hearing. To illustrate this point, a student might write an email to her mom, which goes as follows. Dear Mom, I do not want you to worry about me, but I have some news for you that you're not going to like. After many additional maths classes and consulting with my lecturers, I was advised to take some different subjects to see if there was another option for a major. Having gone through all of that, I have come to a decision that I hope you will support. The news story version would get straight to the point. Mom, I failed maths. In the news story, the listener should, in the first sentence, already be informed of the main point of the story. Other information can be heard later in the story. It's important to keep in mind that in radio broadcasting, listeners are both time-starved and probably doing something else while they are listening to the show, so they are passive listeners. The reality is that people are not intent listeners. They do not hang on every word of a radio news bulletin. They are more likely just hearing rather than listening. Unless the first sentence of each item interests them immediately, they will quite naturally allow their minds to wander until they hear something that does interest them. This is why when writing news for radio, the writing should achieve the following two things. First is to sell the story to the casual reader or listener, and secondly, to bring across the main point of the story very quickly, so that even if the listener stops listening after the first sentence or two, they will still have a decent idea of what the story was about. Today, people usually listen to the news bulletin, and then, if they are interested in further details of the story, they look it up online. To achieve these objectives effectively, a radio journalist must aim to apply the inverted pyramid style of news writing. This is described as a system of writing that tells the most interesting or important information first, followed by the less meaningful information that is added for more context, but does not take away from the impact of the story. The shape of the inverted pyramid shows how the broad top defines the more weighted information and the narrow base, the less relevant information. So look at this figure. Notice how the first paragraph of the news story is the biggest news and how the story tapers down towards the minor detail. The first paragraph, which is called the intro, contains the most newsworthy part of the story. It's the latest angle, the most significant section, and it's followed by the details. The most newsworthy parts of the story will be written closest to the top of the story. The latter part of the story, where the inverted pyramid tapers to a point, contains details that is helpful in creating a fuller picture, but this detail is not necessarily essential. This pyramid format ensures that a story will fit into a concise radio bulletin. It will grab attention and get to the point as fast as possible. The other facts can be cut, but the main point of the story is not affected. So how do we now implement this inverted pyramid? The introduction of the story or the lead is the most important part of the bulletin. It's an artwork of concise information that captures the gist of the story in a maximum of 2 sentences. In the perfect intro or lead, you will find the most newsworthy aspect of the story, short and relevant to the main story. It'll be grammatically simple, able to create enough interest for the reader to read the rest of the story, and suitable in the style of the story. So for example, if the story talks about murder, then the style should be serious, respectful, and measured. Depending on the nature of the story and its driving elements, a lead can focus on one or several of the following 6 question words. Those are who, what, where, when, how, and why. So the 5 W's and H. So if we give an example for each of these, under who, it can be the Gauteng Board of Education members passed a resolution last night banning the use of cell phones in all schools in Gauteng. So the who here is the Gauteng Board of Education. The what is cell phones, because cell phones were banned in all Gauteng schools last night after the Gauteng Board of Education passed a new resolution. So the what here is the ban that was issued. Where? In Gauteng last night, the Board of Education passed a resolution to ban the use of cell phones in all schools in the province. The where here is all schools in the province. When? Last night, the Gauteng Board of Education passed a resolution banning cell phones in all schools in the province. The when here is last night. How? By a margin of 9-2 last night, the Gauteng Board of Education passed a resolution banning using cell phones in all schools in the province. The how here is through the resolution that was passed in a vote of 9-2. And number 6, the why. Citing an enormous spike in cell phone theft and violence due to theft at schools around Gauteng, the Gauteng Board of Education passed a resolution that bans the use of cell phones in all school buildings. The why here is the motivation brought on by the school theft and violence. These are called the 5 W's and the H. So who, what, where, when, why is the 5 W's and how is the H. When utilizing this, a journalist is able to carefully follow the details of the story. So for example, who was drowned? A man called Sipho. If it had been somebody else, would that have made the story stronger or weaker? Only if this detail makes the story stronger should it be included in the lead. Otherwise, it could be mentioned later, as it might not be essential. Once the intro or lead has been written, the journalist must ask themselves the following. Is the most newsworthy point included in the story? Is it more than 20 words? If so, try to cut it out. Avoid repetition and using unnecessary words. Have you used the active voice? Have you put the facts in the first sentence? Is it up to date? Are the verbs in the correct tense? In other words, is the action taking place right now? Has it already taken place? Or is it still going to happen? If the journalist is happy with the intro, they can then move on to writing the next part of the story. This is done answering the 5 W's and the H. So once these have been written out, they need to be placed in a logical, concise, 4 to 5 line radio news bulletin story. Start by choosing the most important details or facts to come after the lead. So as per the inverted pyramid principle. Then present the facts in an orderly manner to provide logical links throughout the day. Jordan gives us 8 steps to follow in order for us to write the remainder of the bulletin. And these are step 1 rather, adjust the language to ensure that it is clear, simple, and concise. Step 2, review to ensure that you have included the 5 W's and H. Step 3, never repeat the information given in the intro or lead. Step 4, if the lead does not grab the listener's attention, then the story will fall flat. Most of the time spent on the story is spent on getting the lead right, ensuring that it's impactful and punchy. Step 5, radio news stories are typically 100 to 300 words long, depending on how many other stories there might be in the bulletin. Read the story out loud so that you have an estimation of how long it will take the newsreader to read the story on air. 100 words or 90 to 100 words are equal to approximately 30 seconds of airtime. Step 6, write the conclusion. This should be a sentence or 2 that sums up the key points of the story. Step 7, Check the whole story over to ensure that it follows the relevant radio station's editorial guidelines and style guide. And lastly, step 8, fact check the script again and review the grammar. The first thing that a copy editor or senior member of the newsroom staff will spot is if there are any language errors. Then there are some final tips for writing great news bulletins, and these are: repetition is the most common error made with regards to leads in radio news. Do not repeat yourself. Avoid commas. This makes sentences very long and hard to follow when they are heard. Break sentences up into shorter parts instead. All copies should be typed and double-spaced to make it easy for a newsreader to deliver on air. Date the first page of the script. Include page numbers. Write out abbreviations. Underline text for emphasis and use dashes for long pauses. Avoid technical terms or jargon that will go over the heads of the public. Check your facts. Journalistic credibility is at stake, so don't be careless. Limit the number of figures that you include. Too many numbers become confusing. Spell out long figures. Where possible, convert long numbers into something more mentally acceptable. For example, instead of saying 25.25 million South Africans, say half the population of South Africa. Use the active voice. Write in the present tense to create a sense of immediacy. Take the when element seriously. So for example, today this happened, or late last night that took place. Be objective in your writing. Do not editorialize or add personal or philosophical comments. News stories are factual first. Discussions, comments, and sparking debate can happen in the radio show among presenters and their listeners later. Never plagiarize. Do not copy words from a press release verbatim. So verbatim quotes are perfect. Verbatim quotes are perfect for audio sound bites, though. Paint a picture that someone can imagine in their mind. With practice, the bulletins you have written must invite the audience to imagine the scene rather than them having to piece the story together themselves. Okay, so if we look at key lecture points again, the list at the top of page 184 is the focal point of this lesson. You should be able to write a concise news story that informs the listener and keeps their attention. The different parts of a news story combine to tell a story. Listeners must be able to see the story. And number 4, news writers have different styles for different media. You should be able to define the following. So significance, prominence, human interest, closeness, and personal impact. Choose the best answer according to the text. Newspapers specialize in detail. Television specialize in pictures. Radio specialize in A, storytelling, B, timeliness, C, conciseness, or D, all of the above. Number 2, if your news story has an abundance of overused adjectives, passive verbs, or lackluster language, you should A, give it to the news director for editing, B, put your writing on a diet, C, hire a news writing consultant. Number 3, informative, entertaining, and what is the essence of a well-told radio news story? A well-told radio news story. A, full of visuals. B, meaningful verbiage. C, up-to-date moment. Or D, talkable. All right, So that brings me to the end of this lecture. In the next class, we will be continuing with news, sport, traffic, and weather. So until then, I say goodbye.